At the height of World War II, in 1944, the skies over Europe were an unrelenting battlefield. Pilots and bomber crew members faced death with every mission, and among the hundreds of stories of bravery and tragedy, one image stood out, a devastating photo taken after a brutal mission over Germany. The image captures the somber moment of a ball turret gunner on a B-17 bomber, one of the most vulnerable and courageous figures in military aviation, who would become a symbol of the war's brutalities. What this image reveals goes beyond a simple photographic record. It shows the human cost of a war that seemed endless. The ball turret gunner, a young aviator, was forever marked after a devastating air attack. But what happened to him? Did he survive the nightmare conveyed by the photo? And if so, how did he endure such violence and continue to fight? These questions are more than mere historical curiosity. They invite us to look deeper into human suffering and resilience during the darkest moments of history. In this video, we will review the records of that fateful mission and uncover the fate of the gunner, whose eyes, in that moment, were locked on the thread of enemy fire and imminent death. It was the end of the summer of 1944, and the air war over Europe was at its most intense. The Allied command had set a clear objective: to destroy Germany's war production capacity. Heavy bombers like the B-17 were the weapons of choice for this mission, striking targets deep within enemy territory, often under the most relentless anti-aircraft fire. The 303rd Bombardment Group, known by the nickname Hell's Angels, was one of the most renowned units among the aviators of the United States Air Force. This name was given after the historic feat of one of its B-17 bombers, named Hell's Angel, which was the first to complete 25 combat missions over Europe. However, the mission we are about to explore, carried out on September 28, 1944, would prove far more difficult and tragic than any before it. Among the many aircraft of the 303rd Bombardment Group was the B-17 Buzz Blonde, a sturdy bomber adorned with the image of a flying blonde, which became a symbol of resilience. The Buzz Blonde crew was nearing the end of their missions, but fate had other plans for them on that fateful day. Captain Frederick Gono, the aircraft's pilot, and his crew were about to embark on a crucial mission, bombing factories in Magura, Germany, a heavily protected target with heavy anti-aircraft defenses. As with any long-range mission, the crew knew the journey would be dangerous, filled with uncertainties. The sky was full of Allied planes, but it was also increasingly saturated with enemy fighters and flak, anti-aircraft artillery, a constant threat that made simply surviving a daily challenge. The aviators were aware that, as they approached Germany, the threats would multiply. The tension was palpable. Each knew their role, but none knew what the near future held for them. And for Arthur Coyle, the ball turret gunner, this would be the day that would change his life forever. With the mission planned and nerves on edge, Buzz Blonde and the other aircraft from the 303rd Bombardment Group took off towards the heart of Germany, where the defenses were more prepared than ever. Coyle's crew, though experienced, knew this mission could be their last, but duty and courage drove them forward without hesitation. The stage was set, a long flight across the English Channel, followed by the approach to the German coast, where the fight for survival would soon begin. Every crew member, from the pilot to the man in the ball turret, knew that the sky ahead could quickly turn into a hell of fire and destruction. As Buzz Blonde and the rest of the 303rd Bombardment Group's formation advanced over Germany, the calm sky quickly turned into a battlefield. The mission was already risky due to the distance and the importance of the target, but the aviators knew the real challenge would come as they neared Magura, where German fighters and anti-aircraft fire would be relentless. For a brief moment, it seemed like the mission would proceed without incident. The aviators allowed themselves a momentary sense of relief as the hours passed and nothing serious occurred. However, Buzz Blonde was still far from its target, and the crew's eyes were vigilant, especially Arthur Coyle's, the ball turret gunner, who at 25 years old found himself in one of the most vulnerable positions. His small plexiglass dome, located beneath the aircraft, was a capsule of vulnerability, and he knew it. But the peace in the sky would soon be shattered. Suddenly, a cloud of black flak bursts appeared around Buzz Blonde, marking the beginning of real danger. The B-17 was flying in a high formation, which generally provided some protection, as lower formations were more vulnerable to enemy fire. But even though they were more protected than the planes in the lower formations, the crew knew the threat hadn't disappeared. The alert came over the radio, breaking the calm that had settled among the aviators. "Bandits, 5 o'clock low." The message was clear. Enemy fighters were approaching rapidly, and the formation would have to prepare to defend itself against a deadly assault. It was a coordinated attack from German planes, such as the Focke-Wulf 190s and the Messerschmitt Bf 109s, both extremely dangerous and maneuverable. The Buzz Blonde crew had no choice but to react. The radio quickly filled with the sounds of warning shouts. Arthur Coyle, in his position in the ball turret, instinctively grabbed his weapons and prepared for what was coming. The sound of machine guns and cannons began to fill the air. The German fighter commander, clearly experienced and determined, ordered his pilots to approach the bomber formation from below, making the attack even more devastating for the B-17 crew. The weakest point of Buzz Blonde was precisely its underside, where the ball turret gunner, like Coyle, and the tail gunner, like Ed Nelson, would be exposed. Arthur Coyle was now at the heart of the chaos. He had done his part in many previous missions, firing at enemy planes trying to intercept the bombers. But this time, the attacks were coming from all directions. The heat and noise of battle were overwhelming. The air was filled with debris and the unmistakable sound of bullets zipping past the bomber's fuselage. When Coyle looked to the horizon, he saw something terrifying. A friend's bomber was being hit, and moments later, it exploded in a fireball, plummeting to the ground. But even in the face of this nightmare, Coyle remained calm and continued firing at the enemy fighters. The situation was becoming desperate. The enemy fighters weren't just targeting 1 or 2 bombers. They were attacking mercilessly, like a swarm of bees in a coordinated strike. The Buzz Blonde crew fought fiercely to keep the plane in the air, but with every passing moment, the situation grew more dangerous. And then, as if all of this wasn't enough, death seemed imminent for Coyle. Amid the enemy air assault, a devastating blow shook Buzz Blonde. Although the aircraft had withstood most of the initial attacks, a new wave of flak, that anti-aircraft artillery which continued to take down Allied planes, hit directly into the bomber's fuselage. During the approach to the bombing zone, a succession of flak explosions struck the B-17. The worst was about to happen. The anti-aircraft fire exploded directly below the plane, hitting the underside of the fuselage where Coyle was positioned. The impact was direct, and a piece of metal flew through the plexiglass canopy of his ball turret, striking him directly in the eyes. The explosion and the shower of shrapnel turned Arthur Coyle's world into a chaotic mess of pain, confusion, and blood. It seemed that Coyle had been fatally wounded, but surprisingly, the young gunner was still alive. The impact had shattered the plexiglass of his turret, and sharp fragments had pierced his eyes, instantly blinding him. Amidst the searing pain, he could only scream, "My eyes! I can't see!" It was a moment of absolute panic. The crew knew that their survival depended on quick action. The plane was under constant attack, and now one of its most vital crew members was severely injured. But despite the dire situation, Captain Frederick Gono kept his composure. He knew the mission could not continue as planned and made the difficult decision to abandon the formation and return to England. The goal was simple: survive. The crew was forced to abort their mission, dropping their bombs over Magura and beginning the risky journey back to base. Even with the aircraft damaged and 3 of its crew members seriously wounded, including Coyle, the plane managed to continue its journey home. The flight was now in a state of utter fragility. The engine was failing, the aircraft was compromised, and the aviators were injured. But still, the fight for survival was not over. With the sky now clear of enemy fighters, a faint thread of hope emerged for Buzz Blonde. The pilot and the rest of the crew kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, anxious to see solid ground. The situation aboard Buzz Blonde was becoming increasingly critical. Despite immense efforts to keep the aircraft in the air, the plane was severely damaged, and the crew was now racing against time to get back to base. The decision to abandon the mission and return to England had been made, but that did not mean the journey back would be easy. For pilot Frederick Gono, the situation was challenging. He was now commanding a mutilated bomber and had to navigate a risky return route, knowing that every minute was crucial for the crew's safety. With the engine failing and part of the fuselage compromised, Buzz Blonde's condition was growing more precarious. The bomber was limping through the skies, its endurance nearly at its limit. However, the crew did not lose hope. Despite the pain many were feeling, especially gunner Arthur Coyle, whose eyes were severely injured, the crew's courage remained intact. The sense of camaraderie among them was palpable. Each person knew their survival depended on everyone else. As if the burden wasn't heavy enough, the aircraft was still in the danger zone. The German anti-aircraft fire continued to be a constant threat, and the possibility of enemy fighters reappearing at any moment still loomed. The crew was exhausted, but they had to press on, one day at a time. The hearts of everyone in the cockpit raced as the aircraft neared the English coast. The radio occasionally crackled with desperate requests for help, and the echoes of battle still resounded in the minds of the crew. But then, a ray of hope appeared on the horizon, the silhouette of British Spitfire aircraft. These escort fighters had been sent to ensure the bombers returned safely. The sight of the Spitfire wings cutting through the sky as a comforting vision brought immediate relief to the crew. The British aircraft began to maneuver around Buzz Blonde, making the crew feel protected again. These fighters were there to ensure no final threat would emerge while the damaged bomber made its way back to base. It was a display of international camaraderie, with the Allies now working together to protect the brave bombers that had completed their mission with valor. The Spitfire stayed alongside Buzz Blonde, maintaining their flight until the bomber sighted the Allied base at Molesworth. As the runway neared, the British pilots began to maneuver away, completing their role expertly. Now, the only concern was landing. Upon sighting the base, the crew of Buzz Blonde felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The condition of the aircraft was precarious. Although the Spitfires had ensured no enemy fighter attacks occurred during the journey, Buzz Blonde's situation was far from good. Captain Gono knew the landing would be difficult, but the achievement of getting the bomber back with all the crew alive was already a miracle in itself. In a bold effort, Gono aligned the aircraft with the runway, now visibly more damaged and struggling to control altitude due to the state of its engines. The crew's hearts were racing. The runway was getting closer, and the moment to land felt like it was stretching into eternity. The tension was palpable. When the tires finally touched the runway, a sense of safety filled the air. The landing was an unstable process, but Buzz Blonde had finally touched down, albeit with much effort and visible damage. Upon landing safely, the rescue team immediately rushed to assist the injured crew. What should have been a celebration of survival quickly turned into an emergency operation, with medical personnel ready to treat the wounded. Arthur Coyle, the ball turret gunner, was one of the first to be attended to. His eyes, now severely damaged by the plexiglass shards, were covered with makeshift bandages, but the severity of his injuries was clear. Despite the intense pain and temporary blindness, Coyle was one of the crew members who began recovering the fastest. His injuries, though serious, were not fatal. He was quickly taken to the hospital, where doctors began treating him. Meanwhile, his fellow crew members also received necessary medical attention, such as tail gunner Ed Nelson and waist gunner Robert Berkemer, both severely injured. Coyle's recovery was surprisingly faster than expected. Most of the injured needed weeks to recover, but he was able to return to his unit in just a few days. His recovery became a symbol of the strength and resilience of the Buzz Blonde crew. Arthur Coyle, who had temporarily lost his sight, was determined to return to his post. With the proper treatment, he recovered and soon was back in action. His courage was an example to all around him. He would complete his tour of missions and survive the war, but like many other veterans, the memories of the horrors of combat would never leave him. In October 1944, a photograph was taken of the Buzz Blonde crew, now incomplete, as two of its members were still recovering in the hospital. Even so, the image reflected the strength and resilience of the crew who, despite so much suffering and sacrifice, managed to survive. Arthur Coyle would continue his military career, remembered for his bravery in facing adversity and the horrors of combat. His story would become one of many that exemplified the unbreakable spirit of the World War II aviators. He lived to tell the story of his time in the sky, and the story of his fight for survival would become one of the most emblematic of the air war. Coyle lived until 2005, passing away at the age of 86. Even after so many years, his memory would remain alive among those who knew his courage and his ability to endure the horrors of war. World War II aviators faced challenges that went far beyond physical damage. The deepest scars were often not visible to the eye. For Arthur Coyle, as for many of his comrades, the psychological impact of the combat and the losses they witnessed on the front lines was a constant battle, even after the conflict ended. When veterans returned from missions like those flown by Buzz Blonde, many found themselves struggling with what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Coyle, who had been exposed to extreme combat situations, including the forced landing and destruction of friendly aircraft before his eyes, was not immune to the emotional weight of his experiences. Although he showed resilience and quickly returned to his post, the post-war environment was different. Many veterans, like him, felt disconnected from a society that could not understand the experiences they had gone through. The world was changing, and the scars of war were becoming increasingly difficult to hide, even beneath the facade of normalcy. Life after the war for Arthur Coyle, like many others, became a search for purpose and a way to move forward. Veterans, once united in battle, now faced the loneliness of returning to civilian life. Some adapted quickly, finding new jobs or engaging in their communities, while others found themselves grappling with the emotional weight of their memories. Coyle, however, managed to find some balance. He never forgot the traumatic experiences, but he seemed to have a unique ability to live for what he considered the mission of his life: to tell his story and educate the younger generations about the human cost of war. He became involved in various aviation-related activities, including events and meetings with other veterans, where he could share his experience. His example of survival and perseverance became an inspiration to many. Those who knew him described Arthur Coyle as a calm and introspective person, someone who sought to avoid confrontation but always had a word of wisdom when necessary. The burden of his war memories would never leave him, but he found ways to make his experience something that did not completely define him. The war, for him, was a part of his life, but it was not all that he was. While the story of Buzz Blonde and Arthur Coyle unfolded as a tale of survival, other crews faced a much darker fate. Not all the aviators who flew through the skies during the mission to Magura, Germany, made it back home. The fate of Buzz Blonde was an exception, but on its journey, many other bombers and their crews were not so lucky. During the mission of September 28, 1944, the 303rd Bombardment Wing, also known as Hell's Angels, lost 9 of its 12 bombers. These aircraft were shot down by German fighters or destroyed by anti-aircraft fire during the intense confrontation. The brutality of aerial warfare made each mission a game of chance, where even the most experienced aviators were not immune to danger. Among the bombers that did not return was a B-17 known as Big Joe, which was shot down after a fierce aerial battle with German fighters. Its crew lost their lives, leaving an indelible mark on the memory of those who made it back home. The accounts of survivors from the 303rd about this mission reveal the horrors of war, where even the bravest were subject to the deadly fire crossing the skies. The surviving crew members of Buzz Blonde were considered heroes, but the tragedy that befell the other aviators was something they could never forget. Each time they returned to base, another friend or comrade was gone, leaving them with a constant sense of loss. The story of the crews who set out on that mission and never returned is not just a reminder of sacrifice, but also a lesson in courage and human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. These crews, now immortalized in historical memory, remind us that, while the names of some aircraft become known, the stories of many other crews remain anonymous, but are equally important. Arthur Coyle, after surviving one of the most dramatic and intense moments of the war, dedicated the following years to preserving the memory of his generation. He was one of the last to live to tell his story, sharing with others the difficulties and horrors of the war, but also the spirit of camaraderie and courage that he and his comrades demonstrated. The way he dealt with the memories of the war, without allowing them to define him completely, became an example for many other veterans. In the years after the war, Coyle actively participated in veterans organizations and aviator gatherings. He helped promote education about the history of military aviation, particularly the crucial role that B-17 bombers and other aircraft played during World War II. His focus was on teaching younger generations about the human cost of war and ensuring that the sacrifices made by him and his comrades would not be forgotten. Although Coyle did not become a famous figure, his legacy endured among those who knew him. His humility and willingness to share his experience with others were traits that gave him a quiet but powerful presence. He had survived the hell of war and, in doing so, became a vital part of a historical legacy that continues to be remembered today. Arthur Coyle passed away in 2005 at the age of 86, but his story lives on. Today, his journey is remembered as that of a man who not only survived one of the most brutal wars in history, but also helped ensure that the sacrifice of all those who fought alongside him was recognized. His story remains an integral part of the historical fabric of World War II, and his courage continues to inspire those who seek to understand the challenges faced by the unsung heroes of military history. In his final years, far from the battlefields, he dedicated himself to preserving the memory of a generation that faced the impossible and returned home, not only with a mission accomplished, but with a new mission, to ensure that future generations would never forget the sacrifices they made.